Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar discussion video. This one is going to be all about Fire Nation history, including information from the Shadow of Kyoshi. So spoilers for that book if you have not read it. I will be covering quite a bit from that. That's going to be the focus of the new information. And this topic was suggested by one of my new patrons, Ronnie Lamar, suggested that I do this, Fire Nation history, specifically with the Shadow of Kyoshi stuff included, with information on Avatar Szeto and stuff like that. So expect a lot of those types of topics. I covered this topic about 5 years ago on the channel, so I'm coming back to it now with some new information. So so one final thing to clarify just before we jump into this is that I'm going to be focusing on a lot of the more sort of scattered information, early Fire Nation history, stuff from the books, stuff from the comics. Pretty much once we hit Sozin, I'm not really going to be going particularly in depth. That's where I feel we know that stuff very well. Sozin, into Azulon, into Ozai, into Zuko, into Izumi. We know that stuff pretty well, and we'll assume get more of that as the comics continue. But yeah, we're focusing on Fire Nation history here, so that's why we're sort of not going too in depth on the modern era of things. So to start off Fire Nation history, we have to start off with basically the era before the Avatar. So that means we have to go to Beginnings, specifically Beginnings Part 1 and a little bit of Beginnings Part 2. And in my mind, the history of the Fire Nation begins with the back of the fire line turtle, the one that Wan lives on with all of his friends and so on. This is the line turtle that the people inside are sort of led by the Chu family, as you can see here. They have all of the power and control, the wealth in the city, and seemingly the ability to sort of ask the lion turtle to, dole out punishment to any of the citizens who commit crimes. So they're an interesting group to consider in terms of, like, by the end of Beginnings, we have no idea what happens, what becomes of them. Do they become a Fire Nation clan going into the future, or do they miss out when everyone else acts? But either way, you can view this group as, at least to some degree, being a very, very early leader of the Fire Nation. Now, obviously, the Fire Nation itself hasn't formed at this point in time, but in terms of the group of people that is going to later become the Fire Nation, here's your leaders of them just before it happens. So obviously we get the specific situation here of this is a fire line turtle, so it is a line turtle that can grant people the power of fire, which we see happen with Wan and the hunters. This is of course back during the era where the spirits basically control most of the physical world in terms of the landmass. That's where they seemingly live, and so humans, to be safe, have to live on the backs of line turtles and can only go out into the spirit wilds with the power of one of the elements to protect them. With the idea being that you get it when you go out and then you give it back to the line turtle before you go back into the city. So it's just a temporary gift, but that makes it very significant when Wan, of course, is banished from the city and keeps the fire. So he sort of becomes, in a way, like the first permanent bender in the world, more or less, at least that we know of. And then more than that, he goes on to then also, in my mind, become the first firebender to learn the dancing dragon from this white dragon, as you can see here. So in terms of just Fire Nation history, that's quite significant. Wan becomes the first avatar. He also becomes the first fire avatar, because of course fire is his element, of course. So the start of the cycle is fire, and so he has all these feats associated with him that is basically like first permanent firebender, first dancing dragon firebender, and fire avatar. So all that stuff is very significant. But in terms of the nation itself, we have to actually turn our attention over to Wan's best friend, Jaya. And he sort of inadvertently becomes the leader of the kind of Wan's people, basically. The lower ranked people, the peasants, basically, of the lion turtle here. The people who aren't the Chu family, basically. They all see that Wan is actually managing to do well for himself out in the spirit wilds. And so they take the power of fire themselves and leave the lion turtle to live on their own in the spirit wilds. So all that stuff works really well to explain to us, okay, just look at this screenshot here. the way they present it, especially with the music that plays during this scene, it very much feels like this is very much meant to be the very, very, very early origin of the Fire Nation. This group of people, these are like the very early ancestors of like the Fire Nation, and it's very interesting to consider that. Of course, we catch up with Jaya and everyone else much later on. They've had a lot of run-ins with spirits and so on. They're sort of seen as being somewhat violent, not particularly spiritual people, but it just highlights the issue between humans and spirits during this era, and that bending allows humans to protect themselves, but it also sort of creates conflict because of that. And Juan is not particularly happy with what happens, but obviously the way Beginnings plays out, Vaatu basically implies that pretty much all of this group is killed in the battle against the spirits, because of course Juan kind of collapses from the proto-avatar state and wakes up and is told that they're all dead. Now, is Vaatu telling the truth here? I don't think so. I think the idea is that some of these have to have survived. At the very least, as you can see here, it's mostly sort of the men doing the fighting, so we assume a lot of the women and children do survive, so the lineage of these people do go on. So they do still remain as sort of like the earliest kind of like clear-cut Fire Nation people in the world. And obviously this, you keep this in mind as you go into the very end of Beginnings. Juan becomes the Avatar, defeats and seals away Vaatu, and then significantly what happens after this is that the Line Turtles make the decision to leave the world, basically. Leave humans. The humans don't need them anymore. It is now the era of the Avatar. The era of the Line Turtles protecting humans is over. And so basically what happened with Jaya and his people, them leaving, taking the element, is more or less what happens with all of the Line Turtle cities across the world. So this is how sort of bending becomes a sort of prevalent thing in the world. This is how we suddenly go into a world, the Avatar world as we know it, where a good amount of people are permanent benders of all of the elements. Again, it is important to note here that there are more than just one line. There's more than just one Line Turtle. There's more than just 4 Line Turtles, one for each element. II specifically states that there are dozens of Line Turtles, so it is implied that there is at least one other, if not 3 other, Fire Line Turtles, meaning that Juan's group here, that we view as sort of becoming like the initial group of Firebender people, probably isn't the only group of Firebender people. And this, I think, helps to explain to us why we ultimately end up having a few very different cultures within the Fire Nation in terms of the groups of people that we've met. Most notably, I think I'll bring in at this point the Ancient Sun Warriors and also the Bhanti Tribe. 3 very different cultures. Like Juan's people, you can tell, oh yeah, this feels a little bit like what will become the sort of the typical Fire Nation people. The Ancient Sun Warriors is a very different culture than anything else in the Fire Nation. And then the Bhanti Tribe, being very spiritual, again is very different. So I think you can view it as being something like that. There's your sort of 3 origins of firebending in a way within the Fire Nation. You have this group of sort of just the normal people. You have maybe the people who maybe are more respectful of the dragons in the Ancient Sun Warriors from maybe one of the other Fire Line Turtles, and maybe the Bhanti Tribe is more of a spiritual group from another Line Turtle. That's some speculation just in terms of getting across the idea that it's not just Jaya's people, I don't think, just because we know there are more than that many Line Turtles. A key point at the end of Beginnings also is Juan sealing the spirit portals. This is a key point just in terms of trying to pinpoint a lot of the location in the timeline of a lot of early events, because you can tell based on, is there a lot of spirits around? Then it's probably before the portals have been closed. Is there no real spirits around? Then it's after it's been closed. So this is quite telling in terms of what's going to happen next. So anyway, after this, the very end of Beginnings is that we find out that as soon as the spirits leave the world, because it's not just that the portals get closed, Juan negotiates with the spirits and has most of them leave the physical world and go back to the spirit world, meaning that for the first time in a very, very long time, humans are now sort of free to have control over their own world. But immediately this brings conflict. Who should have control over what areas and so on? And so we see this war between humans take place. By the looks of it here, and the few images that we get, it seems to mainly be between the people of the early Fire Nation, the people of the early Water Tribe, and the people of the early Earth Kingdom. The implication seems to be that the early Airbenders, as expected, don't get involved. They seem like the most fully fleshed out sort of culture already, and so they wouldn't get involved in the war, and they leave it for the other three bigger groups of people to fight it out for basically control of the world. We see that this is the war that Juan gets himself involved in to try and bring peace and balance back to the world, but it's also the war that he dies during. He is unable to bring peace between humans and dies in the middle of this war. You can see this battlefield where he dies on. We know this is pretty much in the Earth Kingdom because in Zuko alone from Avatar we actually see Zuko wander through this area, and there's the same sort of scattered, old Earth discs in the ground. So either the Earth Kingdom have not evolved their fighting style in 10,000 years, or it's the exact same area. Most people love the connection, so it feels pretty obvious to say that okay, that clarifies a few things to us. That means the majority of this fighting took place on the main landmass of the world. The biggest landmass in the world is the Earth Kingdom, so it was a fight to control most of the world. Now, we don't really get an answer to the result of this, but the idea seems to be that the Earth Kingdom wins this war, and so that the area that they have claimed, the main landmass, becomes the Earth Kingdom, becomes known as the territory where Earthbenders and people related to Earthbenders live. The two losing factions must go their own separate ways as they retreat from the battle. The people of the early Water Tribe go north, not south yet, because the Southern Water Tribe only forms much later on in Waterbender history. So Northern Water Tribe people go to settle in the North Pole, of course, at this point, and that's where, the Water Tribe comes from. And then the early Firebender people must retreat to the west to this collection of islands that's off to the west of the Earth Kingdom, and they become the Fire Islands. This is where I'll bring up the sort of map of the world as you can see it here. So as you can see, the Fire Nation as we know it is actually just a unified group of islands off to the west of the world. It's not one distinct landmass like most of the other nations are. Of course, the air nomads are very scattered. They have a temple in the north, south, east, and west. The Earth Kingdom is one general core landmass, even though it's huge, and then you have the two separate water tribes. But the Fire Nation is kind of quite notable in that it doesn't have, it has one relatively large island, but for the most part it is just a bunch of relatively small islands kind of sort of linked together because they eventually become unified. But there's a bit of history to get through before that. So just while we're on the subject of the map though, the important thing to note here is that we're going to be talking about Fire Nation clans coming up, and the way to view clans is basically just that a certain group of people who have Fire Nation sort of ancestry settle on one of these islands, and it just becomes known as sort of their island. Their leader sort of becomes known as a warlord, and there's basically wars across the Fire Nation for territory at this point. But we'll touch on that as we get into the story of the first Fire Lord and the unification of the Fire Islands. So this is where we get into, as is stated here, we're in this era here where we're post the war between humans. The main groups of people have come to settle in their general locations, but nothing's properly set in stone just yet. So we have warlords on these different Fire Islands, and they're fighting each other for territory, and often the common people got caught in the middle. All these warlords were cruel and ruthless, but worst of them all was a brute named Toes. So there he is right there, the most notable warlord in Fire Nation history, who is known, so many years later after this event as either Toz the Cruel or Toz the Strong, depending on, I suppose, your perspective, and if you viewed him as being like a strong leader for doing what needed to be done, or just cruel for what he ended up doing. So he's a very significant person in that if things had gone a different way in Fire Nation history, we could have been looking at this guy as potentially being the first Fire Lord and having a very negative start to Fire Nation history. But we'll see this story as it plays out. So, feast or famine, Tuz demanded annual tributes from all of the villages in his territory. One year, a village dared to refuse Tuz his tribute, and so to teach them a lesson, Tuz had all of the village's children kidnapped. The children were never seen again, and the village's mothers died in sadness. Soon after the mothers' deaths, dark spirits began to haunt Tuz and his men. So this is basically confirming to us that the mothers who died due to sadness basically became spirits, and these are the Kamurakage spirits. So that's a very significant point in that we have spirits like the Painted Lady. Iroh actually is a human who becomes a spirit, and another example of that dynamic, a human becoming a spirit, is of course the Kamurakage here. So dark spirits began to haunt Tuz and his men. Every so often they would drift into the Warlords' encampment in the middle of the night. The next morning a child would be gone. Out of fear, Tuz's men abandoned him. His regime collapsed. However, the dark spirits, the Kamurakage, continued to appear. Even to this day, their sadness insatiable. So they didn't just target Tuz. They targeted all of the warlords who were cruel and doing similar things to Tuz. Tuz was just the first one, the biggest one to sort of fall due to the influence of the Kamurakage, basically taking revenge for what he did to them. And so they did the same thing to a lot of the other worst warlords in history, which obviously creates a little bit of a vacuum here. A lot of the high up people going down, so there's room for someone to step in and potentially bring peace to this nation, burgeoning nation at conflict here. So this is when the actual Kamurakage spirit appears. So they go from reading sort of the legends of the world to getting first-hand information from the spirits themselves. So for centuries, my sisters and I haunted the warlords of the Fire Islands. For their crimes, we haunted them. We haunted them until the islands were united into a single nation. The first Fire Lord, the one who rests in this crypt, brought warlords to justice and ushered in an era of prolonged peace. Our sadness receded. We never again set foot in the human world. I repeat, Avatar, from the time of the first Fire Lord until this moment, we have not entered your world. And so there you can see on screen are, there's two images, but one of them's like a spirit sort of version of him. But one main image of the first Fire Lord. So this is the guy who pretty much seemingly has this sort of unbroken kind of connection all the way to the present line of Fire Lords. So he's a very significant person in history to bring these islands all together after the spirits caused all of this chaos because of the actions of these warlords. Things were getting very violent, children being the main victim, so something needed to happen, and so he comes in and brings peace. So, very interesting, but ultimately, we don't know a lot about the first Fire Lord. Like, that's pretty much it in terms of stuff that is just directly said about the first Fire Lord. So, there's a little bit more. We can bring in a few other scattered pieces of information to try and make some connections about the first Fire Lord here to end this like first section of the video. So this is where I'm going to bring in the Bhanti Tribe here for a minute. So the Bhanti Tribe we know about in first because of the very start of Beginnings Part 1, the non-backstory part of the episode. Korra washes up on this island after being attacked by a dark spirit. It is a fire island, specifically Bhanti Island, I guess, is basically the name. And here she is brought by some fire sages, interesting, to this temple. There we are introduced to this shaman healer woman who, as you can see here, uses a very interesting sort of non-combat focused firebending technique to analyze Korra's energy, her spirit basically. And once she realizes that she's sort of been infected to a degree by a dark spirit, they realize to save her connection to the Avatar spirit, who is Rava, but we don't know just yet at this point in the episode. They lower her into basically what is considered to be the heart of the island, heart of Bhanti Island, which is basically a source of spirit water in the Fire Nation. And this is where Korra is connected spiritually enough to reconnect with her past lives and get the connection to Wan to, by meeting Rava, restore her connection. So that's fantastic in that it reveals a lot of kind of cool information to us. A new tribe in the Fire Nation, a deeply spiritual people in the Fire Nation, but that seems to be all we learned from the episode. But then you remember, Mike put out an official premise, basically, for this episode, and it includes some extra information that didn't quite make it into the episode itself. So, this is what happens here. So, the leader says that they are on a remote island in the southern Fire Nation seas, and that they are members of the Bhanti, a spiritual tribe whose roots date back to the days of the first Avatar. So, a very ancient tribe who have been around for, pretty much as early as Fire Nation history, more or less. You assume they have to have either formed from, like I speculated earlier on, maybe one of the other Fire Line turtles, or maybe were one of the rare groups of people who were spiritual enough to actually live at peace with the spirits, like Lady Tianhai from the Rift and the village that she watched over. She was a peaceful spirit, so she was happy to just watch over a village of people during that era. They didn't need to be on the backs of line turtles, so maybe the Bhanti were sort of like that as well. It's hard to fully speculate about it because they don't get particularly specific, just that it's the same general area in terms of them being very, very old. So yeah. And then in brackets here, you can see here, some of their ancestors left the island and became the sages for the various nations. Korra doesn't understand how she doesn't know who she is, but a bunch of monks out in the middle of the ocean do. So that's just the kind of idea of like the uniqueness of these people, another sort of hidden, ancient and special tribe within the Fire Nation. How interesting is that? And so you can see later on they cover the idea of the shaman healer having all this information, and you can see where they developed the episode from here. Instead of just the shaman placing her hands on Korra's head, they instead introduced the firebending sort of analysis technique. This is where I'll bring in our first kind of look at the Shadow of Kyoshi stuff, and that is that we meet a character named Nyahitha, who is a member of the Bhanti Tribe. This is back during Kyoshi's era, specifically when Kyoshi is about 17, but he's most notable for being one of Karuk's companions in the era after sort of Karuk left his first group of companions, his friends, his team Avatar. Nyahitha was sent by the Bhanti tribe to assist Karuk with his battles against the dark spirits. And so part of what they did together was that, yes, Nyahitha assisted Karuk with just the spiritual matters in terms of meditating into the spirit world, healing from his big battles with spirits and so on. But together they also went to investigate spirits, to learn as much as they could, to see is there another way rather than just attacking and having to like kill spirits. So they talk about it says it here, they visited the hidden library of the Bhanti, a contender for the greatest repository of spiritual knowledge in the physical realm. And so they go through everything in this, absolutely. And pretty much the only thing that they really discover here is like this sort of puts them on the track to the idea that, oh, Father Glowworm is sort of behind the incident that they're kind of investigating, but that they also realize that there's no special technique at this point in existence that Karuk can use to, peacefully deal with spirits. It's a tease of Unalaq's spirit bending technique, which will be introduced a little bit like later on, a few hundred years later. If Karuk had that, everything would have gone well. But just the Bhanti library, known for being in the physical world the biggest repository of spiritual information, that's very interesting. Also, when Nyahitha first meets Karuk, he does this the same technique that the shaman healer does with regards to the sort of analysis firebending technique. Specifically, it's referred to in the book as this. Nyahitha hauled Karuk to a campsite in the jungle and performed some kind of diagnostic ritual. guiding heat along his energy pathways, similar to the way a northern healer would use the water within a patient's body. He confirmed what Karuk had already guessed, that coming into contact with these dark creatures and destroying them was causing damage to his own spirit. Nyahitha repaired what he could, but admitted a permanent toll would be taken each time another of these battles was fought. Already Karuk was going to be out of the running for longest era in the Avatar history books. So straight away that confirms to us that this ability here is actually a healing technique for your spirit. Whereas waterbending has the ability to heal the physical body and like the chi paths, firebending, this firebending healing technique, is both a kind of diagnostic analysis technique to just sense if something is wrong with someone's spirit, and you can sense if they're like corrupted by darkness, but also you can heal it from corruption in small amounts. So that's a cool, unique ability to give to the Bhanti tribe. But again, the main thing I want to point out from what we just discussed there is actually more about the idea that some of their ancestors left the island and became the sages for the various nations, because we're going to use that with some information we get here from this book, which is Lost Scrolls Collection. Specifically, this is the Fire Nation section of that book, and we learn about the fire sages here. So let's just read this out, and we'll discuss what we can get from it. The Fire Sages are the last of their kind, remnants of a bygone era in the Fire Nation when greater importance was placed on spiritual matters. They live at Avatar Roku's Fire Temple on Crescent Island. Wise leaders as well as powerful firebenders, the sages watch over the sanctuary, protect it from invaders, and gather what knowledge they can about the Avatar. The history of the sages goes back thousands of years. A council of sages led the Fire Nation in its early years. The lead sage was known as the Fire Lord because of his high level of firebending ability and his deep spiritual connection to fire. Throughout the years, the Fire Lord severed ties with the sages and took over control of the Fire Nation for himself. Now led by the Great Sage, the sages are relegated to spiritual matters only. Tensions between the Fire Lord and the sages have increased with each generation. During Fire Lord Sozin's reign, the sages remained loyal to Avatar Roku. They kept watch over the sanctuary in Roku's absence, but after the Avatar's death, Fire Lord Sozin forced them to serve only him. Now, after 3 generations, the sages willingly serve the Fire Lord and counsel him on spiritual matters, except one sage, Shayu. And then the rest is specific to Shayu specifically, sort of pointing out the specifics of him. And I think there's maybe an implication in what they talk about there, that maybe Shayu is also maybe connected to the Bhanti tribe as well, as being like the true line of sages, with what we learned about the Bhanti tribe just a minute ago, that the origin of sages within basically all of the nations does stem back to the Bhanti tribe, and that the firebending members of the Bhanti tribe seem to be able to develop this spiritual firebending technique, spiritual healing. So that prompts the question in relation to the first Fire Lord. The head Fire Sage was the Fire Lord in the early days of the Fire Nation. That's what the book just said before. The Bhanti tribe is the origin of sages from all of the nations. So does that make the first Fire Lord like connected or from the Bhanti tribe in some way? I think that's something to consider, to make some of these connections. Like, is the first Fire Lord a special case, and then like afterwards, like the second Fire Lord was like the first Fire Lord's like head sage and he became the next one and it went from there? Or is the first Fire Lord himself spiritual? I think that's kind of implied because, you know, he's obviously a good leader for the fact that he could unite the people in the first place, but also the fact that he was able to, you know, take a level of control over the Fire Islands and do stuff in a way where the Kimura Kage didn't come after him. Spirits didn't go after the first Fire Lord and respected him enough to view him as being the person ready to unite the islands. Does that tell us that the first Fire Lord was a spiritual person, potentially from a spiritual tribe like the Bhanti tribe? I think that connects well enough to the point where you can be like, okay, I'm willing to make some sort of a jump to like be like, okay, he's some sort of a fire sage, there's a spiritual element to that, and it fits in with the idea that the Fire Nation in its earlier years was much more spiritual, that you have that idea that in its early years the Fire Nation held sort of its political affairs and its spiritual affairs as being quite equal, that the head fire sage was the Fire Lord, and then they eventually separated the positions into being your spiritual leader as well as your political leader, and then tensions sort of flare a little bit as time goes on, and then eventually you get to the point where during Sozin's era he forces the fire sages to be loyal to him and not to be loyal to the Avatar. That of course switches back, of course, after like Ozai's era, with Great Sage Shayu now in charge, and him now able to, support the Avatar in the right way, of course. But the point I'm making here is not that I necessarily think we're meant to view it as like, oh, the Bhanti Tribe were the leaders of the Fire Nation, but that they specifically note that people left the Bhanti Tribe and became the spiritual leaders of the world in other nations, so that the first Fire Lord might be ultimately from the Bhanti Tribe, but he doesn't become the leader of the Fire Nation sort of as a member of the Bhanti Tribe. He just is sort of known as like a spiritual person, but he never, I suppose, publicly notes that he's from the Bhanti Tribe, because they do talk when Nyahitha is first introduced, and Heiran is the one to introduce him, and she's like, he's from the Bhanti Tribe, and Kyoshi's like, the what? And Heiran's like, exactly, you're not meant to know. He likes to keep it hidden. That you get the impression the Bhanti Tribe don't like to be particularly public, and even though they could be powerful and influential, they purposely never wanted to do that, and I think that's why they've remained hidden and active all of this time. Similar to the Ancient Sun Warriors, is because they don't want any part in the leadership, even though their people have the potential to be great leaders, and potentially the first Fire Lord was one of those people. I think that's pretty fair to say, I think, but this is probably one of the main things in the comments I want your guys' thoughts on. Do you think it is reasonable enough to make the connection that the first Fire Lord is, at least to some degree, related to the Bhanti Tribe in some way, or at least one of the people who left the Bhanti Tribe to sort of maybe form the Fire Sages is probably more of the idea we're going for here. But so that brings the like early history to an end, because we don't know a lot about what happens like immediately after this with like the second Fire Lord. So we're going to jump ahead to basically events that are covered in the Shadow of Kyoshi. So this is going to be basically getting into stuff like Avatar Szeto and what he did for the Fire Nation, as well as the war between clans that is dealt quite heavily with in the Shadow of Kyoshi. So one of the key things we're going to be exploring here is the idea of the clans in the Fire Nation and the differences between them and so on. So moving on to the clans of the Fire Nation, we already covered the idea of the Warlords on the different Fire Islands and eventually being united into the Fire Nation as we know it. In the aftermath of that, this is what happens. The Warlords basically become the noble families of the Fire Nation, and these noble families retain governance of their home islands, as well as being allowed to have their own troops separate from the general Fire Nation military. Each clan basically is allowed to have some of their own troops, which is why sort of disputes will happen between the clans. That yes, the Fire Nation has been united here, but it still very much is a group of relatively separate people who have sort of been like satiated by the fact that, okay, our power is like confirmed, we sort of own this island, we just have to sort of support the Fire Lord. So it's sort of a tentative peace and uniting of the Fire Nation. So in the more modern day Fire Nation, each noble family has its origins from a specific Fire Island, and one of the Warlords of old is sort of like their ancient sort of ancestor. So that means that like characters like say Mei and Tai Li as nobles in the Fire Nation, who are they're not part of the royal family, of course, but they are considered to be nobles, ultimately stem back to an island somewhere in the Fire Nation. And that's very interesting to consider. So next we'll get into the three clans that we know about directly. So the first one is the Seinaka clan. The symbol of the Seinaka clan is a stylized whetstone. Their home island is a small island to the south of Capital Island, and it's sort of noted in the book that this island is so small it usually doesn't appear on maps, which is why, like, when you look at it, like, there doesn't really seem to be any island south of the capital. If you look at most of the maps, just a very, very small island. The noted members of this clan are Heiran, Junsik, and Rangi. So that's Rangi and her mother and father, of course, there for the Seinaka clan. And the basic description of this clan is that with no natural resources, the strength of this clan is the talent of its people, who are typically excellent soldiers, bodyguards, or teachers. And their sort of philosophy as a clan is that without their skills, they sort of consider themselves to be nothing. That if they can no longer do what they're kind of talented at, then what is there for them? They have nothing to go back on in their home. So they very much have to be this sort of clan that sort of spreads itself out a bit, that offers their talents to the other islands and stuff like that. So this is a clan that's never going to be the biggest, strongest, most influential, but often because it does have very talented people, they'll get involved in sort of assisting some of the other clans, as we'll see. Next up is the Kyoso clan. The symbol of the Kyoso clan is the winged peony. The home island is Shuhan Island, and the noted members of this clan are Lady Sulan and also Sansur Kyoso. So Lady Sulan, of course, is Firelord Zoryu's mother, and Sansur Kyoso seems to be the sort of leader of the kind of clan at this stage in history. At least he helps with the festival of Szeto. He's considered somewhat notable within the clan. So the Kyoso clan is historically one of the most powerful clans, partly helped by their home island being the second largest island in the Fire Nation, but their power did dwindle during Firelord Zoryu's reign, allowing the Sauwan clan to sort of rise up and become one of the more prosperous clans in the Fire Nation. So in the Shadow of Kyoshi, this is sort of the Fire Lord's sort of main clan, basically, because his mother is from the Kyoso clan. The Fire Lord effectively is from the Kyoso clan. They're not really clear about, is there a specific clan of the Fire Lord, or is it just a case that, the Fire Lord is the Fire Lord, that's the leadership position, and they sort of have a main ally in whoever their parents are. I think that's more of the idea of it. But one final thing on the Kyoso clan is that Shuhan Island, and specifically in the book we see a specific place called North Chungling. That's the sort of town on Shuhan Island that they go to in Shadow of Kyoshi. And we know about this place because we see it in the episode The Runaway. So at the very start of The Runaway, of course, you get this really nice shot of basically what's called Fire Fountain City, or North Chungling as it was known in the past, which is in the Shadow of Kyoshi book. And the book specifically describes this sort of town built sort of in a circle with these wedges stemming off from the center, and also that it's known for being a sort of gambling city, that if you go down some of these back streets you'll find a lot of places to gamble and sort of scammers and so on, but also that there are people who offer sort of fake spiritual experiences, because in the past, even before Kyoshi's time, this place was known for somewhere where actual, like, proper spiritual events would actually happen. And so the legacy of this going forward was that people sort of tried to monetize that, basically, by making false spiritual experiences, mainly with hallucinogenic gas, as is explained in the book. So we'll move on to the Sauwan clan. The symbol of the Sauwan clan is the stone camellia. The home island is Mainka Island, and noted members of the Sauwan clan are Lady Huazo, Cheijin, and Kolin. So, of course, Lady Huazo's son is Cheijin, and Kolin is Lady Huazo's niece, and also one of Rangi's former friends, but now sort of her enemy. And that's the main people that we meet from the Sauwan clan. So this is a historically weaker clan that gained power due to Huazo's leadership, including being able to influence the head fire sage selection to get a member of their own clan promoted to the position over Nyahitha, who was from the Bhanti Tribe, who was kind of set to become the head fire sage at one point in his life. And they're known for being very politically cunning and having this tendency to sort of really sort of needle at other clans, but in such a way where they have this like defense, where if anyone tries to accuse them of something or challenge them to an Agni Kai over some sort of an insult, they always sort of back away and are kind of like, but I didn't really say anything that bad that you can justify fighting an Agni Kai with me over. So they're very good at being, like I said, they're politically cunning and, you know, knowing just how far to step without going too far. But that's a key part of the plot of Shadow of Kyoshi, as we're going to get into. So the book only really covers those 3 clans, but the idea is, of course, that there are multiple other clans that pretty much relate to every other island. And while technically these next 2 aren't clans, because my impression would be that I don't think either of these 2 sort of tribes or groups of people were in any way really involved in the sort of unification of the Fire Nation, in terms of them having warlords who participated in those wars and had to be unified, and, you know, the rules of that unification of the warlords becoming the noble families. I don't think that necessarily applied to these 2 tribes, because I think they were isolated and secretive even back then. So the first one is of course the Bhanti Tribe, which lives on a specific island, Bhanti Island, that, again, it's an ancient tribe they keep to themselves. It's specifically noted when Nyahitha is introduced that he prefers not to particularly let people know that he's from the Bhanti Tribe unless he really, really trusts them, speaking of their, you know, secretive ways. So obviously a very unique tribe here, very spiritual people, known for also being good firebenders, the origin of the fire sages, as we already covered. And obviously they are pretty, you know, set in stone to one specific island. And I don't think they have too much influence sort of beyond that. They have a role in spiritual affairs when big things come up, and of course they are ultimately where a lot of the sages of all of the nations would stem back to overall. But they never publicly go out and be like, the Bhanti tribe is trying to, you know, rule the Fire Nations. So can you really call them a clan in the same way as the others? I don't think so. This definitely feels more like an almost entirely separate culture of the Fire Nation, rather than just being a clan, as in like a group of families that make up that clan. So then you may notice, like, you haven't really talked much about the Ancient Sun Warriors. Well, this is where I'm going to bring them up, because again, I really do view them as being more of a very separate group of people, a very, very separate culture to the rest of the Fire Nation, which is why even in modern day, very few people know the dancing dragon technique or anything like that. Very few people in the Fire Nation kind of wear the same clothes, have the culture that you see when we go to visit the Ancient Sun Warriors. So we can see here Aang and Zuko, when they arrive at basically one of the Fire Islands, there's not a lot on it. It's just a very forested island that doesn't seem to have much on it. But as you go deeper in, you see that sort of hidden among mountains on almost all sides is this civilization that at this stage seems to be abandoned, overgrown almost completely, except maybe some of the stuff in the middle being a little bit more used. But for a culture that seemingly was bigger in the past, it doesn't seem like it's as thriving as it once was. Now, what's interesting is if you rewatch the Firebending Masters episode, Aang and Zuko constantly make comparisons between things that they see here with the Ancient Sun Warriors and like, oh, this inspired the Fire Sages. This looks a lot like sort of what early fire temples would look like. And so you have stuff like doors opening based off like lights during the solstice hitting them and stuff like that. Stones and jewels being the activation kind of mechanisms and so on. But, of course, the unique thing about the Sun Warriors is their name, Sun Warriors. The sun, surprisingly, isn't really brought up all that much by firebenders. Like Zuko, I think, mentions it like once in the whole Katara, with the fights that he has with Katara at the end of book 1, noting that, of course, waterbenders are stronger when the moon is out and firebenders are stronger when the sun is out. But it's never emphasized as much as the Sun Warrior culture emphasize it. It's to the point where we still to this day wonder, there's a moon spirit, is there a sun spirit? or anything like that. So they're a unique culture because, of course, they very much worship the sun, but they also worship dragons as well, and they're very, very respectful towards dragons. And while dragons were around, as Aang says, like, dragons were around during his time, and there's even that comic Dragon Days where he meets a dragon with his friend Kuzan, and again they point out dragons were only began to be hunted during Sozin's era. I still get the impression they were pretty rare animals, which is why only the likes of Roku and Sozin really had them, and no one else. That realistically, their locations were probably based in or around the Sun Warrior people, who maybe were more public with the dragons in their past when there were a lot of them, but then they themselves chose to almost go forgotten, act like their people went extinct along with the dragons to protect the last of the dragons. The same thing that Iroh does, basically. And so you can even see, looking at the Sun Warrior kind of chief here, that like very different clothing and style to like everyone else in the Fire Nation. There's elements of it there, and that you can see most of the other people have some sort of a, kind of, ponytail type thing, top knot. So, it's still Fire Nation, of course. But then one of the other unique things with the Sun Warriors is, of course, they bring Aang and Zuko over to this flame, which they describe as being the first ever flame that was given to humans by the dragons. Now, he specifies it in a way where, like, he just says, this is the first ever flame. And then he says, it was given to humans by the dragons. So, like, how much stock do you put in it literally being the very first flame ever in the physical world? I'm not particularly sure about that. I think it's more of potentially a thing of the first group of Sun Warriors, when they met a dragon, the dragon gave them this fire along with, I suppose, the true way of firebending. And they've kept it going all this time as a significant part of their culture, that this fire that stems back to a dragon from the past is quite important. Now, is there any significance? Maybe is this the fire from that white dragon that Thoth won? I'm not really sure. It's maybe a little bit too much to speculate that. There's no obvious connection. Like I said, the Sun Warriors realistically were probably from one of the other fire line turtles, because again, there were dozens of them. It's highly likely there were other groups of people who would become the Fire Nation. And like I said, there are three very separate groups of people. There is the Bhanti Tribe, which seems separate but also similar in some ways spiritually to the ancient Sun Warriors. The Sun Warriors themselves feel different than the Bhanti Tribe because they're more about firebending itself. With the idea seemingly being that nearly all of them are firebenders, and it kind of feels almost like an airbender style culture where before the genocide, every member of the air nomads was an airbender. And it seems to be a similar way here, that maybe their spiritual approach means that they're all born as firebenders, and that fits their culture overall. And then you have Jaya's people as being the sort of more normal people of the Fire Nation, and so on. But yeah, you have the dragons, and then we see in kind of modern day, I guess, they focus on the last two dragons in the world, apparently, Ran and Shaw. So really, really cool stuff. Like, they're such an interesting group of people. I'd love to get more information on them, but unfortunately we don't really. Now, some people have asked the question, okay, exactly how old are the Sun Warriors compared to the Bhanti Tribe, and so on. I think it's very difficult to properly tell for multiple reasons. Is that, like I said, the key point in terms of timing a lot of early stuff is this pre or post portals, in terms of not a lot can happen in the physical world when the spirits are still in the spirit wilds. So unless they were always in the long past an isolated people and managed to be out there in the spirit wilds, maybe with the help of the dragons, you sort of have to place them after the portals, because they're a firebending culture. So they only can have permanent firebending is if either they separately left their line turtle earlier or afterwards formed their culture. So I think this is one of the few sort of errors on the Avatar wiki, in that they note that the ancient Sun Warrior ancient Sun Warriors like predate the formation of the Fire Nation by thousands of years. That I don't think is correct, and I don't think can be correct, because I don't think there's any way to basically have thousands of years happen between basically Juan sealing the portals and then the first Fire Lord, like I talked about. I really struggle with that. I think the first Fire Lord stuff has to happen much closer to Juan than we think. So, and then from what I could see, like, there's no real support to that statement as well. Like, Zuko says thousands of years with the ancient Sun Warriors a few times in the episode, but again, we have 10,000 years to work with. I think it's more just that they are a very old culture, but they're not like pre-Juan. Whereas at least with the Bhanti Tribe, it is very clearly stated that they were a tribe around during the era of the first Avatar. Now, can you make the statement that the Bhanti Tribe is older than the ancient Sun Warriors? Perhaps, mainly because I suppose their main thing is that they're spiritual, not that they're firebenders. They get firebending eventually, but they could be a tribe that existed before that because of their spirituality and actually maybe having a connection with the spirits. I think that fits maybe a little bit nicer than trying to say the ancient Sun Warriors are even older. But again, we don't know. There's a bunch of separate stories that have to be happening sort of behind the scenes during beginnings that we just don't know about. Final thing is just, the Fire Sages and basically this sort of kind of linking things together. Like I said there, in the Firebending Masters, they link the idea of a lot of ancient Sun Warrior architecture, sort of ends up being used by the Fire Sages, and then we know the Bhanti Tribe is like the origin of the Fire Sages. So the question is there any way to connect the Sun Warriors and the Bhanti Tribe outside of them being sort of isolated, sort of spiritual firebender cultures that the Fire Sages then sort of take from? I think it sort of highlights that the mainland of the Fire Nation sort of takes bits and pieces from a lot of its other sort of separate cultures. So it has some elements of Sun Warrior, some elements of Bhanti Tribe, and its own thing as well, the whole honor and clan stuff as well. So the main thing to get across here is just that, these two specifically, Bhanti Tribe and Sun Warriors, I don't think they're clans. I think they are very separate cultures within Fire Nation, and the clans are a pretty separate thing. You know that from the fact that, Zuko talks about the ancient Sun Warriors as if like they've been gone from the world for a long time. Not even Aang knows about them. So they've been, quote unquote, extinct for a good while, and then the idea is that very few people in the world even know about the Bhanti Tribe. So two secret tribes that have been around since the beginning, but also haven't played as big of a role as you think, but then also kind of have. It's very, very interesting. But the clans, the other clans, the actual ones like the Senaka, Kyoso, and so on, it is just important to note the sort of tentative piece between them, because they ultimately are still separate. People on their own islands, allowed to govern them themselves, have their own soldiers. So of course, feuds, wars are still going to happen, just on a smaller scale, because we're no longer in a sort of era of feuding warlords. But there's still going to be disputes between the clans, even if they don't want to sort of like anger the Fire Lord or anything like that. They've agreed to be united as the Fire Nation. That these things are still going to happen. And let's get into some of the other events now here. So let's talk about Avatar Szeto here. So he's a very interesting character because he's primarily, of course, known by the fandom as Avatar Jafar, because we get the clearest look at him, obviously, just as he kind of goes away forever, basically, as the past lives are destroyed. We see he is one of them that, of course, is lost as Rava is destroyed, and we get our best look at him here, and you can see, of course, Fire Nation, red robes, but also the unique aspect is basically just that, oh yeah, his head and the hat and stuff like that, he looks kind of like Jafar from Aladdin. We've always wondered what exactly is that about. That's his unique design trait as an avatar. In ATLA, during the first episode of Book 2, The Avatar State, we do feature him as someone who demonstrates the Avatar State for firebending. Now, This was, I think, obviously before they'd properly figured out lava bending, so they actually show the fire avatar lava bending instead of doing anything inherently about fire. But still, Avatar Szeto activates the avatar state and just makes like 4 volcanoes erupt. Now, I think they're relatively small volcanoes, but still, very, very powerful feat here by Avatar Szeto. And then what was so interesting was that we actually finally learned the character's name in the Shadow of Kyoshi. He went from being Avatar Jafar to now being Avatar Szeto. And then they took the completely different path with the character. Instead of like, oh, he's known for making volcanoes erupt. But no, he's actually known like almost entirely for his bureaucracy, his diplomatic feats than anything else. The book doesn't cover anything about his bending training, fights he was involved in, or anything like that. It's just what he did to basically prevent the Fire Nation from going to war and returning to the era of the Warlords. And this is it. During the reign of Fire Lord Yosor, the Fire Nation suffered greatly from plagues and natural disasters. This led to the clans fighting against each other for resources and power. The Fire Nation was close to returning to the era of Warlords once again. Szeto applied for a position in the Fire Nation government and demanded no special treatment as the Avatar. He was able to use his skills as an accountant, bureaucrat, and diplomat to rise through the government ranks and effect great change in the Fire Nation, including ending disputes between the clans. His era also had no tensions with the Fire Lord, since he worked for the government, so every success for the Avatar was a success for the Fire Lord. So he really navigated the political aspects of the Fire Nation perfectly here to solve this problem. They go into a little bit more depth if you read the section on him in the book by kind of explaining like, oh, how he helped avoid like an economic collapse and stuff like that. But fundamentally, it's just this avatar who basically has the skills that are like the very opposite of Kyoshi. Kyoshi is being told about Szeto, and she's being told about an avatar who has all of these political skills that she doesn't have, and she almost wishes she had, but will never have. Yet here he is, the perfect diplomat avatar, able to stop a war without needing to like fight or do anything like Kyoshi does when she deals with a similar situation, which we'll cover next. I find that very interesting that, Yang Chen is known for like so much. She's one of the great avatars for creating all these treaties between nations and so on. But Szeto specifically is known for just how well he did stuff in the Fire Nation, and just very cool that, he applied for a position in the Fire Nation government. He wasn't just given it, he applied for it and got it himself, demanded no special treatment as the Avatar, and was able to just, as I said, rise through the ranks and achieve these very powerful positions. And he avoided the situation that can at times happen between a Fire Avatar and the Fire Lord of, does the Avatar at times overshadow the Fire Lord? In his case, he avoids that completely because everything he does is from a government position, and he is working directly for the Fire Lord. He's not just like assisting the Fire Lord as the Avatar, he works for him as part of his government, and that eases everything so perfectly. So, lots of praise for Avatar Szeto and his very unique characterization here. But anyway, I mentioned that incident that Kyoshi had to deal with that was sort of similar to this. Another thing that was putting the Fire Nation once more on the road to returning to the era of Warlords and just disputes between clans. So that is the Camellia-Peony War. So I have 4 slides here, a lot of text on them. I wasn't really sure what way to cover this because this is basically the main plot of the Shadow of Kyoshi. So this is just a pretty long recap of the book. I'm just going to read this out. It's not, I don't know if it's particularly well written. I think I cover most of the details without going into crazy depth. But anyway, during the reign of Fire Lord Zoryu, a conflict was brewing between him and his older half-brother Chaejin over who should be Fire Lord. The conflict goes back to the romance between Zoryu and Chaejin's father, Cheryu, and Cheijin's mother, Lady Huazo. They were in love as teenagers, but at the time, Huazo's clan, the Sewon clan, was not considered a strong clan, so Cheryu's advisors began to meddle with this relationship. They began to encourage Cheryu to end his relationship with Huazo and accept an arranged marriage to Lady Sulan of the favoured Kyoso clan. He accepted the arranged marriage and was ready to forget about Huazo until she revealed she was pregnant. This forced Cheryu into a position where he had to acknowledge this illegitimate son as part of his family, but this son would not be part of the line of succession to the throne. So Huazo is basically about to be completely removed from Cheryu's life here. She thinks that she's potentially on the pathway to becoming the Fire Lady of the Fire Nation here, and suddenly she's pushed out by the advisors meddling in her relationship. But she's able to sort of keep herself sort of in play by sort of more publicly announcing that she's pregnant. And this obviously makes Cheryu kind of look bad, like having a child out of wedlock and stuff like that. And Cheryu, so as not to just completely dishonor her and her clan, has to acknowledge that this is his child. But it's not part of like the actual royal family because it was born out of wedlock. And it's so interesting, this situation, that Cheijin, who is born here, is the older brother here. So anyway, we move on. Fire Lady Sulan died giving birth to Zoryu, his name also becoming an issue for the people of the Sewon clan, as typically names featuring Zo are reserved for members of their clan only. So Sulan of the Kyoso clan having a son with that name was not received well by the Sewon and already had tensions rising between both of the clans. Huazo then worked to improve the Sewon clan and led it to being the most powerful clan by the time Zoryu actually became the Fire Lord and Cheryu had died. Zoryu's era was not going well, with poor crops and little fish to catch. Just the way they describe it is that the spirits are not looking well upon the Fire Nation. Just all the things that is basically just like weather, are the crops doing well, the stuff that a Fire Lord can't really control. It was great during Cheryu's reign, but not so good during Zoryu's reign. So everything's sort of going wrong for him as he takes the throne. Huazu and Cheijin both worked to improve their reputation across the Fire Nation in an effort to make a claim for the throne. Going to part 2 here. Cheijin would wear robes very reminiscent of the Fire Lord in an effort to draw more attention to himself, as well as just him being a better, politician, basically, looking better in most situations around his brother. This is where opinion began to, divide here. Not everyone was super happy with the way their current Fire Lord Zoryu was, and maybe this guy is better. That's what began to happen. Huazo began to buy businesses and properties on various different fire islands to further showcase the power and influence of the Sewon clan, and this also served the method of also like antagonizing these clans as well, just showing like, look at the power that I have. I'm going to buy a little bit from all of your islands, but you can't do anything about it because I just bought them. These actions angered the Kyoso clan, and tensions between those two clans begin to simmer. Zoryu, in an effort to look strong, invites Avatar Kyoshi to the Fire Nation, but during the introduction party, Cheijin once more outmaneuvers Zoryu, and he is the one to look good with the Avatar, embarrassing Zoryu and making him look weak. Kyoshi's lack of political knowledge here does not help the situation, but by the end of the banquet, she does ally herself with Zoryu. So you get the situation where Zoryu and Kyoshi, when they first meet, both sort of in a way end up bonding over both not being particularly politically astute, and they both make mistakes at this kind of meeting because of all the rules surrounding how you're meant to introduce each other as the Fire Nation. The thing that she got wrong here was that Zoryu and Cheijin actually look quite similar, and because Cheijin wears robes that are similar to the Fire Lord, she mistakenly introduced herself to Cheijin as if he was the Fire Lord, and so she's like publicly calling him the Fire Lord in front of everyone, and it just was like, oh, is the Avatar supporting Cheijin as being the next Fire Lord, was sort of the takeaway almost. And he completely leaned into that, but by the end she realized she was being manipulated. So she informs him that even the royal painters seem against him, as she tells Zoryu of the Sowan clan symbol being painted on his father's royal portrait. So that is the stone camellia being painted sort of over the winged peony. So Cheryu would have the Kyoso clan symbol on his portrait, but they've put the Sowan clan symbol on it as well. They decide to both keep this a secret from everyone because this probably would immediately incite a war, with the Kyoso clan immediately wanting to attack the Sowan for doing something like that. So antagonistic in terms of like getting into the royal painters and having them, basically paint the wrong thing on like Zoryu's dead father's portrait. That's not a good move. So at this point here, Yoon attacks the party and holds everyone hostage as he then attempts to assassinate Heiron, Rangi's mother of course. As he escapes unsuccessful, he kills the Chancellor of the Fire Nation as well as some guards. Once more, Zoryu is made to look weak, especially when he is slow to act in the aftermath, with Chaejin and Hwazo picking up the pieces and being the ones to sort of prevent the Fire Nation from immediately sort of going after the Earth Kingdom, because Yoon's from the Earth Kingdom, and calming them down about the whole idea of like, he's just an individual, this is not an attack from the Earth Kingdom against the Fire Nation, but one person. So they are the ones to calm that down, where Zoryu is just completely caught out in this situation. So early on, your impression of Zoryu is that he's not up to much. He's not a very good leader. And while you don't agree with the Sowan clan and their sort of almost petty tactics, Zoryu is not being particularly effective as a leader. So let's go into part 3. Kyoshi and her friends witness tensions flare up between the Kyoso clan and the Sowan clan in North Chungling on Suhan Island, the Kyoso clan's home island. Hwazo and her entourage walk through the streets confidently, almost asking to be confronted by the Kyoso. She notes that she can do this because she has recently bought a nearby salt mine and a house nearby. Seconds from the first scuffle of a war about to happen, Heiron, Kyoshi and Co. step in to calm things down. Like, they just barely avoid a scuffle from breaking out here. After Kyoshi gets her first vision from Avatar Kuruk, she notices a message in the melon yam crops stating, "Hail Fire Lord Chaejin." She rushes into town and finds the two clans once again on the verge of conflict, now seemingly an inevitable conflict due to the message. As the clans throw insults at each other, Rangi's former friend Kolin insults her mother, which causes Rangi to throw the first punch of the conflict. The Sowan and Kyoso finally clash in northern Chungling. Yoon uses this conflict as a distraction to try and kill Heiron again. He nearly succeeds, but again has to flee after suffering an injury. So the only thing I'd add there is, of course, Rangi is from the Seinaka clan, so she is actually the one to set off the first actual engagement between the Sowan and the Kyoso, because Kolin from the Sowan clan insulted Heiron so heavily in this moment. So that's just an interesting point. But anyway, Kyoshi, realizing she has to act fast, comes to the conclusion that Yoon was working with the Sowan to make Zoryu look bad. Her evidence is that Yoon used his bending to create the melon yam message, and everything he has done is against Zoryu. More specifically, the point there is that when she goes over to the message, she realizes that, oh, the earth has been salted here, which has caused these melon yams to sort of like die, basically. So she realizes that it would have taken so long to do this just by basically throwing out salt to make this message. Yoon, who has displayed amazing precision with earthbending, must have been bending salt into the ground to make this perfect message. So she realizes, like, what the message is, "Hail Fire Lord Chaejin." He has to be working for the Sowan. Why else would he write that? So she decides to force a confession out of Hwazo and Chaejin and kidnaps them both, threatening them harshly, basically threatening to kill them unless they tell her the truth. Her theory is wrong, as even like mother and son basically about to be killed next to each other. Neither of them reveal that they are working for Yoon, and it becomes clear they're honest about not involving Yoon in this. Yoon is not working with the Sowan, and she realizes her harsh actions have now made Zoryu's situation far worse. When Hwazo and Chaejin return to the capital, there will be war. That Kyoshi's in Kyoshi's effort to act as soon as possible, and getting it wrong, war is now inevitable. The only saving grace is that she had taken Huazu and Cheijin away from the capital to threaten them. So once they make the walk back, war is on. Zoryu is going to go down. But getting into the final part here, as Kyoshi returns to the palace, she finds Zoryu prepared to make a big announcement. He announces that he has been tested by the spirits and has passed that test now that he has captured Yoon. His guards drag Yoon out before everyone, and Yoon gives a full confession to everything, including being hired by Huazo and the Saowan. Immediately, the other clans turn on the Saowan and capture them. The Saowan, now framed for Yoon's actions, which dishonor the entire Fire Nation, they have no defense, and their efforts to antagonize the other clans have now worked against them. Kyoshi cannot believe Zoryu has captured Yoon and so goes after him. When she gets to Yoon, she discovers it is not actually Yoon, but a political double that looks a lot like him. Zoryu has offered to remove all of this man's debt and help his family if he plays this role and dies to complete the ruse. Kyoshi can do nothing as she has been utterly outplayed at this game of politics, this time by Zoryu, who has seemed so ineffective and inactive this whole time. In one move, he has destroyed everything the Saowan clan have built up and improved his reputation as a leader tenfold, in addition to now putting Kyoshi in a no-win situation. So, Zoryu makes one big move in this entire book, and it is the thing that pretty much brings the Camellia-Peony War to an end. He just effortlessly brings this into play. It is noted as a minor detail that the reason they have a double for Yoon is that when Yoon was thought to be the Avatar, he and John Ju actually suggested that the Fire Nation have a double for Yoon ready so they can kind of foil assassination attempts and so on. So that's why they actually did sort of conveniently have a double for Yoon, in that it was set up earlier on, just so that weird kind of dynamic in the story is actually quite well explained. So yeah, and it's a big moment for Kyoshi, because like it's a very emotional moment, as she has to just accept that like this guy's trying to protect his family and is fully accepting being executed, because of course the Fire Lord is going to execute Yoon for what he did. So this fake Yoon is going to die to fulfill Zoryu's plan here, and he's fully on board with it. And Kyoshi is just like, what sort of a situation is this where a man has to die to make this political ruse happen? And she just really bemoans how bad at politics she is, that she's been so outplayed and is sort of powerless in this situation, because if she keeps him safe, his family is going to suffer. If she stands back, she has to just accept that he's going to die. So the no-win situation for Kyoshi that she's been put in by Zoryu now is that she can either stand by and let the reappearance of the real Yoon destroy peace in the Fire Nation, guaranteeing a war, because of course if the real Yoon shows up, Zoryu's what he's just done here with the fake Yoon is going to be revealed to be a scam, and everyone's going to turn on Zoryu, and so war is going to happen, and that will give the Saowan even more power. So she can either guarantee war and like Zoryu losing and just a power struggle in the Fire Nation, or she can do what she's struggled with the entire book, make the decision to go after and take out Yoon. That way, with Yoon dead, Zoryu's ploy will have worked 100% and war will be averted. Kyoshi reluctantly accepts that she will have to confront Yoon, but threatens Zoryu, making sure that he will not have the Saowan clan or the fake Yoon killed like he had planned. Kyoshi does manage to kill Yoon at the end of the book, and in doing so, basically brings an end to the Camellia-Peony War. Things turn for the better in the Fire Nation as the rain returns and crops improve. So, kind of revealing that the whole issue that sort of caused this, created this sort of rift within the Fire Nation, was just people being frustrated in a way with the weather and the way crops were going. They're not being fish to catch, and that was purely in a way just down to luck and just the turn of the seasons, basically. His father had a great run, but his early reign was marred by everything not going great. And right as he makes his big move and becomes the Fire Lord finally that people can respect, things go better for him. So everything seems to be turning out well for Zoryu, and he was even able to sort of stand up to Kyoshi and not particularly be afraid of what she had to say with regards to her threat. But that's what we're going to cover next, in terms of right at the end of the Shadow of Kyoshi. They do some set up for what's going to happen with Sozin and the ambition of the Fire Nation coming into fruition. Zoryu hasn't just made one big action and it's worked out well for him. There's more to it than that. This is him really considering the future, a big plan, a big project to improve the Fire Nation in his mind. So, after his successful political maneuver and the confirmation of Yun's death, Zoryu plans to defy Avatar Kyoshi by having the Saowon clan and fake Yun executed. He has a grand plan, a plan that may take generations to bring to fruition. He needs to make it so that the Fire Lord is who everyone in the Fire Nation is loyal to first, not their individual clans. His destruction of the Saowon clan will be the first step, and after that, he and the Fire Lords after him would have to work to make the clans weak and irrelevant, so that one day a Fire Lord can sit on the throne without the need to worry about the clan disputes threatening the throne. Kyoshi, knowing Zoryu may defy her, sends Lao Ge to deliver a message to Zoryu, that Kyoshi will no longer play political games with him, and that she is what happens when diplomacy fails, that Kyoshi is watching him and will come for him if he goes ahead with his plan to destroy the Saowon clan. And his plan is literally to execute everyone they've captured in the capital and lay siege to Meinka Island, where the rest of the Saowon clan is. He literally plans to exterminate the Saowon clan, so Kyoshi has to threaten him so that he doesn't commit an atrocity here, just in an effort to keep power. Zoryu is furious, but notes that Kyoshi will not be able to watch him and the Fire Lords after him forever. But Lao Ge just leaves, laughing, knowing that Kyoshi can in fact watch him and those who come after him for as long as she wants. Because Lao Ge is the one who taught Kyoshi the technique for how to live basically as long as you want. The secret to quote-unquote immortality in Avatar. Why Kyoshi lives to be 230 years old. Lao Ge is the one who teaches her to live that long. So Kyoshi lives to be 230 years old, so she likely deals with a few Fire Lords after Zoryu and does keep the destruction of the clans from happening. Because I think we would have heard about it if there was some massacre of multiple clans in the Fire Nation as part of the history. So it seems that for the most part she stops the atrocities from happening. But it does seem like she is unable to stop the position of Fire Lord from becoming the all-powerful position that Zoryu wanted, as by the time of Sozin, he doesn't seem to have any clan squabbles to deal with, and is able to make big moves that impact the entire Fire Nation without any opposition, except for Avatar Roku. So, I don't know how confirmed that is, but that's, I think, just, reasonable speculation of, Sozin makes some big moves as the Fire Lord in terms of occupying land in another nation. Yeah, he just does that on his own. There's no mention that the clans oppose him in doing that. The only hint of opposition is that it seems like he has a little bit of trouble with the Fire Sages at some point in his reign, and has to really force them to be loyal to him and not be loyal to Roku. But that happens after Roku dies. It doesn't seem like the clans are really a thing, so maybe some issues with the Fire Sages, but that's about it. And then especially with him going to war, attacking the Air Nomads, you'd think some of the other clans would find that dishonorable in the Fire Nation. But no one stands up seemingly, and we don't hear about any rebellions or Sozin needing to take out sections of the Fire Nation, at least as far as we are aware. So by the time he comes to power, he is that all-powerful Fire Lord who doesn't need to worry about the clans. So it's an interesting one. Kyoshi's able to stop one aspect of Zoryu's plan, but not the other. And then Roku, of course, then has to attempt to deal with Sozin, and then Aang, of course, is the one after that. So, yeah, just some final things that you may not be aware of is just that in the book Legacy of the Fire Nation, we get this really interesting piece of art that is, of course, of a younger Azulon. So this is Sozin watching Azulon sort of train here. And in the same book, they just note generally within the Fire Nation royal family that they very much, try to have this dynamic within royal families, especially if there's multiple sons, so multiple people in line to the throne. They really try and foster a rivalry and borderline anger between like sons to try and get them to compete for the throne. And this is seemingly, you know, why the Fire Lords end up having that kind of ruthless line that stems from, I suppose, Zoryu all the way up to Ozai, is because of just this atmosphere that begins to develop in the Fire Nation, I suppose, pretty much from Zoryu onwards. And even then, they sort of hint that Cheryu wasn't the best guy either, with, you know, how he handled the relationship with Wazo and so on. So, you know, it definitely presents that there was corruption in the Fire Nation leadership before Sozin. It was just that Sozin was able to do a whole lot more because he didn't have clan squabbles to get in the way of everything. And then the final point I'll make is just this other page, also from Legacy of the Fire Nation, that features some of the portraits of the Fire Lords. So you can see here 5 portraits. Along the bottom we have, in the middle, Ozai. On the left is Sozin, of course, and on the right is Azulon. So the question is, who are the 2 Fire Lords on the top? Do we even know who they are, or are they just 2 random Fire Lords? Well, because the 3 on the bottom are technically like 3 in a row, they're not in the right order, but it would be, you know, Sozin, Azulon, Ozai. That fits, of course. So are the 2 on the top basically Sozin's father and then Sozin's grandfather? It's hard to say exactly, because I don't think we have any information whatsoever on those characters. But I also don't think either of these 2 are meant to be Zoryu or Cheryu. And probably not Yosor also. So probably these are meant to be the basic idea for what, you know, Sozin's father and grandfather did look like. And, you know, it's just interesting to note the kind of differences between them all, in terms of just the way their portraits are designed, and that the guy in the top right has a sort of like some sun imagery sort of going on. The guy on the top left has some kind of flower stuff going on. And I did check within the book, because we do get Cheryu's portrait described, and it does say that it has like vegetation in it, but it mentions like bundles of rice and stuff like that because of how prosperous the Fire Nation was during his era. These just look like some flowers, so I don't think that is meant to be Cheryu. And I don't think we know enough about Zoryu to state that it's him. So that would just might be my guess. Of just these are the 2 before Sozin. But yeah, that's the Fire Nation history that I wanted to cover in this video. Like I said at the start, everything else after that is more or less what we know. I think we all know from 306 Avatar and the Fire Lord what Sozin goes on to do during his life, his issues with Roku, you know, starting the war, the Air Nomad genocide, the switch to then attacking the water tribes, and we can't attack the north because of the ice field in front of it, so they go after the south. Azulon continues that trend onwards, and then we of course move into Ozai's era, and so on. And then more into kind of Korra time, you know, Zuko is the Fire Lord, then it's Zuko's daughter Izumi, and that's where we are right now, where we haven't heard a lot about the details of the Fire Nation of late. But I think most people get the history that happens, you know, after this, basically. Especially now that we have a little bit of setup from the end of the Camellia-Peony War to establish why Zoryu and sort of the way Fire Lords end up going. I actually like that as a bit of like subtle development across the generations. So yeah, that's the video. Once again, I'll mention that this was a Patreon selected video, so if you want to select a topic for an upcoming Avatar discussion topic video, you can do so by joining the Patreon at the $5 tier or more. Link in the description to my Patreon, so you can check out the details there. But again, $5 tier or higher is how you get the kind of perk to choose the topic for an upcoming discussion topic video, like this video, like the Kuroka video from a week or 2 ago. But yeah, in the comments let me know what your thoughts are on Fire Nation history and a lot of the questions that I brought up surrounding some of the stuff that's a little harder to piece into the timeline, like was the first Fire Lord from the Bhanti Tribe? It sort of suggests he could be. What are your thoughts on that, as well as some of the other points that I made in this video? But yeah, that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.